Once upon a time, deep in the heart of a remote mountain range, there lived a poor miner named Samuel Hartley. Samuel had spent his entire life digging through the rocky earth, hoping to uncover the fortune that would free him from poverty. Year after year, he had toiled in the mines, his hands becoming thick with calluses, his back bent from years of hard labor. The lines on his face told stories of disappointment and weariness, but his heart still held on to a flicker of hope. Hope that one day, perhaps tomorrow, his life might change. Samuel wasn't young anymore. He had seen many winters come and go, and though his body was worn down, his spirit refused to break. Every morning, before dawn broke, he would leave his tiny cabin in the valley, strap on his weathered boots, and make his way up to the old, abandoned gold mine. The mine had long been deserted by other prospectors. They had all given up, convinced that the veins of gold had run dry. But Samuel wasn't like the others. He believed, deep down, that there was still something hidden beneath the cold, hard ground. He couldn't give up now, not after all these years. One crisp autumn morning, with the first hints of frost clinging to the earth, Samuel set off for the mine, his breath visible in the chilly air. The sun was only just beginning to rise, casting a soft golden glow over the rugged landscape. As he trudged along the familiar path, something unusual caught his eye. There, lying among the fallen leaves just off the trail, was a small figure. At first, Samuel thought it was some forest animal that had wandered too close to the mountain's edge. Perhaps a deer that had strayed from its herd. But as he approached, his heart sank. It wasn't an animal. It was a child. A small boy, no older than 7 or 8, with torn, bloodied clothes and a face that was far too pale. His little chest rose and fell weakly, but he was alive. Samuel's heart raced as he knelt beside the boy. "Hey there, little one," he whispered softly, his voice rough from years of solitude. "Can you hear me?" The boy stirred, his eyes fluttering open ever so slightly. He gazed up at Samuel with a dazed, frightened look, then let out a soft whimper, more out of confusion than pain. "Don't worry now," Samuel said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I've got you. You're safe with me." The boy tried to speak, but his voice came out in a rasping whisper, and his body trembled with exhaustion. Samuel quickly realized that the boy was injured, likely from some kind of fall, or perhaps something even worse. There were scratches and bruises all over his fragile frame. And his clothes were torn and dirty. Without wasting another second, Samuel scooped the boy into his arms, his body surprisingly light. He cradled him carefully, feeling just how cold the child's skin was. The boy's head lolled against Samuel's chest, his breathing shallow, but he clung faintly to life. Samuel turned and hurried back toward his cabin, his mind racing. Who was this boy? How had he come to be out here, in the middle of nowhere? As far as Samuel knew, there were no other settlements nearby, no families traveling through these mountains. It didn't make any sense. When Samuel reached his cabin, he pushed the door open with his shoulder and carried the boy inside, laying him gently on the small bed by the fireplace. His cabin was humble, just a single room with a bed, a small table, and a hearth where he cooked his meals. But it was warm, and it was safe. Samuel quickly stoked the fire, adding more wood to the flames, and then fetched a rag and a bowl of water. He gently wiped the dirt and blood from the boy's face, his hands trembling with a mixture of fear and hope. The boy's skin was pale, his lips cracked and dry, but there was still life in him. Samuel couldn't let him slip away. For hours, Samuel stayed by the boy's side, tending to his wounds as best he could. He wrapped the boy in blankets to keep him warm and gave him small sips of water to keep him hydrated. The boy would drift in and out of consciousness, sometimes mumbling incoherent words, sometimes crying softly in his sleep. Samuel could only guess what kind of horrors the child had seen. As the sun set and the cold night crept in, Samuel sat by the fire, watching over the boy. His mind was a whirlwind of questions. Who was this child? Where had he come from? And most of all, where was his family? The next morning, the boy began to stir more frequently, his eyes fluttering open and closed. He seemed to be regaining strength, though his face still held a shadow of fear. Samuel was sitting by the fire, boiling water for tea, when he heard a faint voice, "Mama." Samuel turned quickly and moved to the boy's side. "You're awake," he said gently. "You're going to be all right, son. You're safe here." The boy's eyes were wide and glassy as he looked around the small cabin, clearly confused. His voice trembled when he spoke. "Where's my mama?" Samuel's heart clenched. He wasn't sure how to answer. "I don't know, son," he said quietly. "Can you tell me what happened?" The boy blinked, trying to remember. His small hands gripped the blankets tightly as he struggled to speak. "We were in a plane," he whispered. "My mama and me. We were going to see my dad." The plane started shaking. And then there was this loud noise. And everything went dark. Samuel's breath caught in his throat. A plane crash. That explained it. The mountains were remote, difficult to navigate, and in bad weather, treacherous. Planes rarely flew over this area, and when they did, it was only for emergency routes or private flights. Samuel had heard no news of a crash. After all, there was no radio in his cabin, no way to communicate with the outside world. He had no idea how long this boy had been out there, alone and injured. The boy's eyes welled up with tears as he whispered, "My mama. She wouldn't wake up. I tried, but she wouldn't wake up." Samuel felt a lump form in his throat. He had no words for the pain this child was going through. He gently placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "I'm so sorry, son," he said softly. "But you're safe now. I'm going to take care of you." The boy's name, he learned, was Daniel. Over the next few days, Daniel's strength began to return, though the pain of losing his mother still weighed heavily on him. Samuel did everything he could to help the boy recover, feeding him, wrapping his wounds, and keeping the cabin warm and safe. He spent his nights sitting by the fire, keeping watch over the boy as he slept fitfully, often waking from nightmares, calling out for his mother. Daniel told Samuel bits and pieces about his life. His father, James Davenport, was a wealthy businessman who lived in the city, far from the mountains. Daniel and his mother had been flying to visit him. But they had crashed somewhere in the wilderness. Daniel couldn't remember much about the crash, only the fear and confusion that followed. His mother's lifeless form haunted his memories, and the pain of her loss was still fresh in his heart. Weeks passed, and as winter approached, Samuel began to realize that staying in the mountains was no longer an option. The weather was growing colder, and the food supplies were dwindling. The remote cabin, while a haven for the time being, wouldn't be enough to keep them safe through the harsh winter months. More importantly, Daniel's father was somewhere out there, likely searching for his missing son. They had to find him before it was too late, so one morning, after a particularly cold night, Samuel made a decision. He packed what little they had, some dried meat, a few loaves of bread, and the last of the water, and told Daniel they were going to leave the mountains. It was a long and dangerous journey to the nearest town. But they had no other choice. "We'll find your dad," Samuel promised as they set off, the cold wind biting at their faces. "I know he's looking for you." The journey was slow and grueling. The path was steep, the air thin, and the weather unforgiving. Samuel did his best to keep Daniel warm, wrapping the boy in blankets as they trudged through the snow and ice. The nights were the worst, cold and dark, with the wind howling through the mountains. But Samuel never let his hope waver. He had survived many harsh winters before, and he would survive this one too. For Daniel's sake, it took them several days to reach the outskirts of the nearest town. By the time they arrived, both Samuel and Daniel were exhausted, their bodies worn down from the long trek. But they had made it. The small mountain town was a far cry from the bustling city that Daniel had known, but it was a place where they could find help. Samuel asked around, hoping that someone might have heard news of a plane crash, or perhaps seen a man searching for his missing son. To his surprise, the townspeople had indeed heard about the crash. It had been the talk of the region for weeks, and search parties had been sent out. But the mountains were vast, and many believed that no one could have survived such a catastrophe, but Daniel had. One afternoon, as Samuel and Daniel sat in the small town cafe, warming themselves by the fire, the door suddenly burst open. A man rushed in, his face pale, his eyes wild with desperation. He looked around the room, scanning every face, until his gaze fell on Daniel. The moment their eyes met, the man's face crumpled with emotion. "Daniel?" The man whispered, his voice trembling. Daniel's eyes widened in disbelief. "Dad?" Before Samuel could react, the man was across the room, scooping Daniel into his arms. The boy buried his face in his father's chest, his small body shaking with sobs. "I thought I lost you," the man whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I thought I lost you both." For a long moment, father and son held each other, the weight of the past few weeks crashing down on them. Samuel watched from the side, his heart swelling with relief. He had done it. Daniel was safe, reunited with his father. Finally, James Davenport, Daniel's father, turned to Samuel. His face was etched with gratitude and exhaustion. "You saved my son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you." Samuel shook his head humbly. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "I just did what anyone would do." But James shook his head, stepping forward. "No," he said firmly. "You did much more than that. You saved his life. I don't know how I'll ever repay you, but I'm going to try." And so, Samuel's life changed that day. James Davenport, true to his word, helped Samuel with more than just a monetary reward. He brought him to the city, gave him a comfortable home, and ensured that Samuel's mining days were behind him. But more than the material wealth, Samuel gained something far more valuable: a family. Daniel never forgot the man who had saved him, and from that day forward, Samuel became a permanent fixture in their lives. In time, Samuel learned that the greatest treasure wasn't the gold he had spent years searching for. It was the love and connection he had found in Daniel and James, a bond forged in the hardest of circumstances, yet stronger than any vein of gold hidden in the mountains. And so, The once poor miner who had spent his life searching for riches found something far more precious, the love of a family in the knowledge that true wealth lies not in gold, but in the hearts of those we care for, and thus, Samuel Hartley, the poor miner, discovered a fortune far beyond anything he could have ever dreamed of. A fortune not measured in gold, but in love, family, and hope.